Hello, I'm Bruce Whitfield, and welcome to A Seat at the Table, a 360-degree virtual reality experience which gets you to participate in the podcast like you never have before. We've got some of the brightest people in the country discussing some of the most topical and pressing business issues of the moment. So we've reserved for you a seat at the table. Hello, welcome to the table. We saved you a special seat here at our table. If you have a look around you, you'll see I'm surrounded by some very clever and erudite people. Talk about capital and liquidity. Let's introduce you quickly. And there's Khulekani Dlamini at the end of the table over there. Mark Barnes over here. Dave McCall, he's the guy with the money. You need to suck up to him. And then we've got Akua Koranteng, who is the head of capital at the Safiso Learning Group. So now you've met everybody, it's nice to have you with us. Now pay attention because this is participative. Nodding? Excellent, good. Dave McCall, now listen. Capital and liquidity, opposite sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah, I think so. Bruce, I think the question is, how you get the balance between the two. And I think, clearly they're part of the same overall business process, but they're fundamentally different. I mean, capital is a bit like fat. When you go through shocking times and you go through, going through the desert and you run out of water, you obviously need a bit of, kind of capital to keep you going. Whereas liquidity is a little bit like air. When you run out of air, what tends to happen is you tend to pass on quite quickly. So I think the point being is that the world's changed, and what got us here is not necessarily the same complexity that is going to get us to where we need to be in the future. Things are going to get more difficult, more challenging, and how we apply capital and how we find liquidity is going to be of utmost importance.
I mean, it's a problem you might face at the post office, Mark Barnes. The world is different, and you've got to have your various stakeholders providing you with the capital that you need so that you can get the liquidity that you require to deliver the letter to, I don't know, Umtata, for example.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you've got to have the right economic model that someone's prepared to invest in. So, I mean, I don't want to talk about the post office, but it's a turnaround model. So it needs to be deeply steeped in equity. It needs lots of reserves so that it can see itself through a difficult liquidity situation. But I mean, just generally, if you look at the world is awash with cash at the moment. So they're awash with liquidity. And that's primarily because after the financial crisis in 2008, reserve banks made it their business to make money cheap. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the reason they did that is they wanted people to go back and invest in the real economy, okay, which is all about giving people the confidence by making money the enemy. And so money is now really, really cheap, and still people aren't investing it. And so we are now looking at asset prices which are inflated, almost beyond returns.
Capital's been invested in assets, and we've seen asset prices almost explode. We've got stock markets around the globe at record levels, but money hasn't been invested in growth assets.
Yeah, the issue right now is that they've all gone up. So bond prices are high, stock market prices are high, property bubbles are wherever you want to see them. And so the argument could be made that they've gone too far and money is too cheap. And so now the clever people are starting to see investment in a different dynamic. So all the old metrics of net asset value and price earnings, all of these things no longer define why you would take a risk in Bitcoin, or why you would have invested in Facebook, or why you would have invested in Alibaba, which is the third biggest bank in the world today. Okay. And so the world is changing, and the challenge for all of us is to start being able to understand the mixture and capital of liquidity that will define value going forward. So, for example, Amazon, which we all know is a massive, powerful organization, I don't think it's made a profit yet.
No, nor is
but
Uber.
It's an extraordinary, and the dynamic there is client acquisition strategy, which everyone's investing in because the populations are growing and so on. And the harvest will come later. But they've needed extraordinary capital and extraordinary faith from shareholders.
They could never have grown in a different era, possibly, Okoye. I mean, that's what's so interesting about these businesses, because 10 years ago, you needed to make a profit within 12 months, otherwise Dave gives you a friendly call to say, please pay back the money. Nowadays, there is far more latitude if you've got a plan that shows you might deliver a return over time. That's the different world maybe Dave is referring to.
Absolutely. I think market dynamics are changing, and 10 years ago, your millennials weren't present, and today they are. And I think their approach and their ways of thinking are completely different. They're providing an asset class that's alternate and giving investors an option to invest in something that they otherwise wouldn't have invested in the past. Look at your Ubers, you look at your Airbnb. It's a different model, and I mean, as an investor, patient capital, and if the idea makes sense to you, then you'll definitely invest in it.
Khulekani, aren't we asking for trouble, though? I mean, if we're changing the way the world works, while interest rates are low and while capital is cheap, it's fine until it's not anymore, because it may feel like it's different this time, but is it really?
Well, I think it is. I think if you think of the sources of capital, right, they're no longer the same. Also, the risk that capital is willing to take, it's no longer the same. So if you go back to the 1928s, where the Great Depression occurred, you were getting bonds yielding significantly more than what equities were yielding. So bonds were presumed to be riskier than equities. Now, we think about bonds very differently in this day and age. So I think we're seeing a transition where the risk premium that is attached to capital from different places. Dave is no longer the go-to party for capital anymore. There's many, many, many other people who are willing to take, or for whom risk is represented very differently than what a normal banker typically would. And so they're willing to give capital.
I think the point being is that,
he's picking a fight.
Well, I think we must make a clear distinction between debt versus capital. And debt's obviously on the cost of borrowings. But actually capital, rather than looking at the source of the capital, is really the application of the capital. And it's the opportunity cost of not taking those opportunities that present themselves. And I think that's where the dynamic is going to change.
But are you guys thinking differently?
But think about it. I mean, if you're going to Europe today, and in Europe they're saying to you, I'll give you a -2% interest rate. I mean, I'm not going to go to a bank if that's what's happening. If I am sovereign and I need to borrow, I'm going to go to the people that are willing to give me the money for free, or basically are going to pay me to borrow money from them. I'm not going to go to Dave. And I think that's where the problem
I
is.
do think you have to introduce the question of time here, because if rates in the US are 2% and they go up by 0.5%, the cost of servicing that debt has gone up by 20%. Okay, and so you have to see the folly in very low interest rates as well. And I think getting the mix right has got a lot to do with what you brought up at one point, the J curve, and at what stage of capital maturity are you, and how much risk can you tolerate, and how patient are your shareholders, and all of those things, because you can't eat share certificates. Okay, you have to have money to buy food. Okay, and so getting this balance between growth and investment, and because of all this cheap capital, it's gone the other way. So you've got corporations sitting with trillions of capital, even in this country. And the worst thing that they are doing, in my view, is buying back their own shares. It basically says to your shareholders, I've got nothing to do with your cash. I'm going to give it back to you.
So what's the catalyst then for the future?
Well, I think when we talk about risk-adjusted returns on capital in terms of the deployment of capital, I think that's where when you start talking about the art and the science of this thing. The math can add up to one thing, but it's really about, in a different environment, a different macro context, a changing global environment, and even in Africa and the like. I mean, we've got to look at things slightly differently. And I think those macro factors are very different to what they were 10 years ago. I think the volatility of the change, not only in terms of the extent of the change, but also the rate of change, makes it that much more difficult to really quantify the risk-adjusted return.
Okay, now our guest over here wants to know if you're going to lend them some money. I mean, they're the FD of a small and medium enterprise in South Africa today. They're hearing about patient capital, they're hearing about free money, and then they're hearing that you have got big pots of cash, but they're finding it hard to extract it from you. How best do they extract it?
I think what's quite interesting is that the philosophy of banking is, in the old days, was I buy from the bank and the bank sells to our clients. But in actual fact, we're twin faces of the same coin, because to the extent that we're going to deploy our capital, obviously we want a commensurate risk-adjusted return on that capital as well. I think what's changed is the way that we start engaging with clients in terms of, we start talking about targeted returns, in terms of, well, it's not necessarily this year that we're worried about, it's about the future growth potential and your ability to obviously repay and provide a degree of return to ourselves over the longer term. And I think that's what's important, especially in this country, when everyone is sitting on piles of cash, is how do you start to forecast, well, what is it going to look like in 5 to 10 years? And how do we get over that hump to start actually deploying it in consultation and conjunction with our clients?
And the biggest problem you've got is confidence. I'm sure, yeah, you're nodding. I know. It's about confidence, and it's about getting confidence into a system. And that comes from political confidence, economic confidence, but also, Mark Barnes, you talk about asset prices being elevated around the world. At some point, and history will teach us multiple times, the story, the fairy tale comes to an end. There are various ways it comes to an end, but that's why we don't have the confidence.
Yeah, I think at a micro level, the way you get confidence is by deep understanding, okay, of the economic model that drives your business. There's no shortcut to that. You have to be able to distill the essence of why you make money before you can raise money at the right price.
Okay, summarize it for me then, quickly. We need to wrap up. Akua, tell our guest, please, how this world has changed and what they need to do to have better capital and better liquidity structures in their businesses.
Again, just speaking back to my initial point that I made, I think it's important to assess at what point of the business that you're in. And again, today, it's not just traditional debt. You've got various options. You've got a lot of angel investors out there. You can securitize. You can, I guess, still stick to the bond market, for example. But I think it's really, really important to just assess at what point in the business that you're at. And as was mentioned initially, just really focus on your capital requirements, number one, and obviously liquidity, because they are two sides of the same coin, essentially.
Okay. Khulekani, take some risk, for goodness sake. We're not going to grow this economy. We're not going to get confidence into this economy unless you're prepared to take some risk.
Absolutely. And I think banks actually need to change the way they assess risk. I think that still remains something that has not changed over 3-4 decades. And if you think about what risk is quantified as now, banks are just still far, far, far behind. They don't know how to fund
Has this world
IT
changed,
businesses.
Mark? I mean,
No, it has.
you had a dark history
This
as a
is,
bank.
this is why the world has changed. Is because access to capital and knowledge about capital is pervasive. It's in your pocket. Crowdfunding, understanding, all of those things about investment are available to individuals now. They no longer belong in the smoke-filled bar rooms of stockbrokers. Get to know the cost of capital and do some thinking yourself, and you'll get the money cheaper.
Yeah, are you in the market? Are you competing there?
Yeah, and I think, again, the point being is that these discussions need to take place. And I think, as I said before, I think the bank has got such a huge role to play in developing that confidence. And clearly we need to look at the way the world has changed. But by the same token, I think it's also imperative upon business owners and business leaders to really introspect and get out of the berth of the ship and get onto the bridge and look a little bit further into the horizon, because I think there are opportunities there. And so we always talk about, well, what is the cost of capital? But what's the opportunity cost of not doing something? And I think that's when we start talking about capital and liquidity together. It's really making the whole become greater than the sum of the individual parts. And it's more than just the maths. It's about having conversations like this, and it's about developing that confidence and hopefully growing business, which enables the country to grow and for us to do better.
Panel, thank you very much. Nice to have you all here. Thanks very much for coming. And thanks for coming. And thank you for taking your seat at our table.